Welcome to Let's Talk with myself, Regan DeLoggins, and John Kane. John, are you there? Can you hear me?
Yes, I am. All right, we got rid of the echo here. I don't know. There was about 10 Regan DeLoggins on the line just then.
Great. That's awesome. Well, welcome everyone to another episode.
Well, you can never have too many. You can never have too many Regan DeLoggins, you know. So I mean, all right. Look, for everybody, we were off last week. We are in fund drive mode, and that's part of the reason we were off last week. So I do want to encourage people, if you want us not to be off during fund drive, then you got to support the program. And by supporting the program, you're obviously supporting the show. So, you're supporting the station. So again, as Reggie said during the break, 516-620-3602. That's the number to call to make a donation, a pledge of any size. You can do a weekly donation by signing up as a BAI buddy. You can make a one-time donation. And look, we understand this is unprecedented times. But if you have the resources, if you have the ability to support one of the places that you go to for reliable information, for engaging conversation, if you have the resources, then make a contribution. And if you do it in the name of the show, then maybe we don't get preempted. And we haven't been preempted much, so I'm not going to complain too much. But obviously, we like reaching out to you every week, and it is our goal to stay relevant, to stay contemporary to whatever's happening that's in the news today or close to that. So that's what we tried to deliver. So again, 516-620-3602. You can go online. You can go to give2wbai.org, and you can make a donation there. You can follow the prompts. You can even do a text donation. But we do rely on you, the listener. We are listener-supported radio, and even in these unprecedented times where we're broadcasting from home, we're broadcasting from remotely, we're doing stuff by phone, by Skype, by all these other services. We're constantly working to improve the product in spite of what we're all going through. And again, we rely on you. So again, pledge line 516-620-3602. That's the number to call to make a donation. And I know that Regan and I greatly appreciate whatever support you give to this program, because it sends a signal not only to management, but basically you're speaking for the silent majority that listens without contributing. So we appreciate those of you that do. All right. Again, I know we had a lot we were ready to talk about last week, and nothing. It seems like a lot of this stuff just continues to stay relevant. Statues and mascots and all of this stuff of the political climate of Trump going to Rushmore, Trump going to Tulsa, now a big uptick in coronavirus cases in Oklahoma, and now we're waiting to see what impact his visit to Mount Rushmore is going to have on South Dakota's numbers. But we are living in amazing times. But while all of this stuff is going on, there's almost a strange connectivity. And Regan, I want to ask you specifically. Think about this. How did we get from the murder of George Floyd to Dan Snyder not just seriously contemplating, but essentially he's going to change the name of the Washington football team? Give me an idea what your thoughts are. I mean, on how we get from there to here.
That's like a really great question. And it's something that we've been discussing in a lot of the direct organizing circles I've been in, as well as the academic circles that I'm in. And what it really boils down to is that this is, as you said, an unprecedented time. And we always say that historically, this time is unprecedented, this time is, and it's true because historically there have been so many moments. And I think that right now, the moment that we have reached is that people of color, specifically Black people and Indigenous people and our Afro-Indigenous kin, are fed up. We are done. Not to say that we weren't fed up previously and that we weren't traumatized previously and weren't resisting in the past. We've been doing this. We come from legacies of resistance. I think that this is just a very important time where everyone has been educated, not everyone, but a large portion of people within our communities have been educated radically and feel empowered. I think social media has a huge part to do with it. Seeing, so many things shared constantly, providing us with radicalized education that we now know and now feel empowered to really step forward in a way that we haven't seen before. I think feeling as an Indigenous person connected with so many other Indigenous people via social media, I feel empowered in a way that I haven't felt before. And I not to say that everything has to do with social media, but I definitely believe that there has been a short amount of time with a great escalation in the radicalization of people. And a lot of that is based on Twitter, on Facebook, on Instagram, on these platforms that people use to uplift abolitionist theory, to uplift Black liberation, to uplift Indigenous liberation. So not to conflate the two, but I just think that this is definitely a very important point in time where people have access to education in a way they did not.
I also think, and I was listening to a program that talked about empathy and the idea that white privilege in many ways negates a certain level of empathy, especially amongst the white elite, because they can't own, some of that sentiment. But I think, and probably in ways that other videos didn't. I think the murder of George Floyd, I think it tapped into a lot of people, not just people of color, not just Black people, not just Native people, but I think a lot of people saw that and said, yeah, I kind of, and again, to understand what empathy isn't just the idea of, isn't sympathy. Empathy is about seeing it through the perspective of somebody who's the affected people. And I think a lot of white people finally couldn't take it anymore and said, yeah, this is too much. And, what's crazy to me is we had Tamir Rice, we had, Eric Garner, we had, over and over, Sandra Bland, all these people, that this has happened to, but I think even some of the pleas that were happening to the people who were begging the cops to get off of Floyd's neck. I mean, I think it turned an empathy switch on to a lot of people who were certainly not empathetic at all. So when people talk about this, it wasn't even the straw that broke the camel's back. It was about tapping into something that I think all of a sudden people said, wait a second, maybe we aren't looking at this stuff. So, right. So now, let me try to understand the Native perspective. Let me try to understand the perspective over the Confederate monuments. I mean, look, military brass are saying it's a slam dunk to remove Confederate flags from military bases. It's a slam dunk to rename the bases. They're saying this is easy to do and it makes sense to do it, but nobody was doing it. Nothing was happening, and it's like in this very relatively short period of time, and of course the movement, people were out on the street, folks like you out there on the street. I mean, when I think about how much was tapped into and how many people responded, and yeah, I know there's been an activist community for many years, but I think something changed a little bit. And I think, somebody was describing empathy as a muscle that has to be worked. And I think it atrophied. I think it atrophied bad. And I think when this happened, I think people all of a sudden felt a little muscle pain they hadn't had in a long time.
Speaking of empathy, I saw a poster at a protest, and it's gone viral now. And I know a lot of people have remade the poster. But I saw the poster that said, all mothers were summoned when George Floyd called out for his mother. And that, when I first saw it, it made me cry because it was such a true statement. And it's something that we forget, and something that happens in dehumanization, and something that is constantly pushed down our throats, especially by the carceral state, especially by the police state, is it dehumanizes people. There's constant, oh, well, this person was a criminal. Oh, this person resisted arrest. Oh, this person had a broken tail light. All of these things that are meant to dehumanize. And to see that poster go viral really resonated with me. And I'm not a parent, but I'm not a parent. And I saw that poster and it made me want to cry, but it was so true that, a lot of people have been murdered by police, and George Floyd's murder, his unjust murder, it has really ignited a lot of these protests. And the fact that as he was dying, he called out to his mother is something that I believe a lot of people can relate to. There isn't, people have to hear that, have to read that, have to see that, and empathize in a way that I don't think they could have possibly done in a lot of other instances because of the constant dehumanization of Black people specifically by the police. And so I agree that there is a better understanding of empathy now, and I think people are trying to navigate the situation now. And I'm interested to see 10 years down the line what people say and how this has transformed how people think of others. But that poster really, it was a poster, but it was so true.
Yeah, I saw it. It was powerful because we all have a mother, and the idea that we could be in that most vulnerable of times, that the only thing left to cling to is a call out to your mother, dead or alive, and so that was that was pretty moving, and I agree with you. But I agree that's a lot of this was all part of what I think really called upon a lot of people to rethink how they view somebody other than themselves. And I think that's what has played out a little bit here. Let's shift gears a little bit. I know we wanted to talk about, there's three major Native issues that are kind of out there, that are transpiring as we speak. The Mount Rushmore thing, is continuing to be a story, not just because Trump just, flew, his actions fly in the face of reason, trying to have an event in these desecrated mountains, desecrated by, in a political agenda when they carved those faces in the mountain, carved by a white supremacist, a guy who was, connected to the Klan and all. I mean, the story just goes on and on. But Mount Rushmore has been a thorn in the side of the Lakota people since the beginning. And I think it's one of those things that is never properly addressed. Obviously, the courts have ruled in favor of the Lakota on a claim to the Black Hills. There was an attempt to try to buy them off, which they rejected. And so there's this constant tension with, a white supremacist carving into a mountain that they viewed. They called it the Six Grandfathers. That's what they called the mountain face, because it did have roughly the shape of figures standing there. And then it was desecrated by putting 4 presidents, and look, they all earned the name Run of the Gaius as far as this Mohawk is concerned. But in this situation, you can specifically pinpoint some of the white supremacy that was espoused by all 4 of those guys, and then it's carved for many years, mostly to overlook Lakota territory. It's been promoted as a tourist spot, but it's South Dakota. It's not like it's got this huge tourist draw there. So there it is as a constant reminder to the Lakota. So I guess we'll start with Mount Rushmore, then we'll get into the Dakota Access Pipeline and the Oklahoma decision. Give me your thoughts on where things are, or what you're hearing on the Mount Rushmore issue.
I think something that's important to know about Mount Rushmore is that, do we even call it Mount Rushmore? I will call it Mount Rushmore for the sake of listeners to understand what I'm about to say. Mount Rushmore is like all other statues and monuments. It is a signaling of white supremacy. We cannot forget that coincidences don't exist historically. It was not a coincidence that these faces were carved on an indigenous sacred site, just like it's not a coincidence that Confederate statues and other white supremacist figures are placed throughout different city centers, often in neighborhoods of color, to remind and to threaten BIPOC resistance. So I think that we need to frame Mount Rushmore in the same way that we frame a Christopher Columbus statue or a Confederate statue. It is just but the difference is that it included desecration of a site. I mean, arguably you could say putting up a statue on indigenous land is desecration, which I do believe, but I need people who are listening to understand that this is on the same level, that it has become a tourist site to celebrate white supremacy. So just in case people didn't know, 21 people were arrested during the protest near Mount Rushmore last Friday during Trump's visit. And people who were there had protested along the road and created a blockade to prevent access to Mount Rushmore National Memorial. And the protesters had cited that the Black Hills are sacred to Indigenous folks and that the Trump administration opposes interests of Indigenous people and other people of color, which obviously is true. So a number of these vans blocked off the road, and there was like a bit of a standoff between the National Guard and a group of Indigenous folks who were, as I said, were arrested. And they were located about 200 yards north of this intersection of highway. That is the only route into the national park. So the way that I feel about it is that I think it was awesome. I think it was just awesome. I think it was completely unplanned. It was unprecedented, unplanned, and I think it shook the National Guard. I saw pictures in which the National Guard's shield was spray painted with the word "land back" on it. And I would advocate that people donate to the Indian Collective, NDN Collective, for bail funds, because there were 21 people arrested and they deserve our continued support. And I hope that this just ignites more people to continue doing this work because it shook the Trump administration.
Right. And as it should have. I mean, and one of the things that was clear from a number of the, of those who are regarded as leaders of some of that Lakota territory, they all said, look, we never get permission from to come there. So I wouldn't even call Trump's trip there a visit. I would call it a trespass. And the fact that he, they would do fireworks and knowing that there was a threat of fire as a result of it. I mean, trying to use this thing as a backdrop, and who knows how much money something like this must have cost. And just like in Oklahoma, that is now seeing an uptick in coronavirus cases, we're just kind of waiting for the germination period, I guess, to find out how many people are going to, having gone to Mount Rushmore for this Trump event, are going to end up contracting the coronavirus. The irresponsibility and as you were saying, the idea of putting these statues up, it isn't a coincidence. It isn't a celebration. It is a message. And keep in mind, Theodore Roosevelt, who is the most recent or the most contemporary of the four faces on it, it was his presidency that probably inspired getting this thing done. And he was a devout white supremacist. I mean, there was no question about it. There are probably more quotes associated with Theodore Roosevelt in terms of white supremacy than any of the presidents, and they all have plenty. Let me say that. And so, I mean, I think the idea that his presidency would inspire this desecration of this site it is just like the statues, the Confederate statues going up during that Jim Crow era that were supposed to, that was totally meant to intimidate and to create fear amongst the black communities. That's exactly what this was intended to do to the, and not just to the Lakota. I mean, understanding that it is in Lakota territory, but that was a signal to all of us. And I don't think there's any way to really deny any of that.
Yeah, I think that's something that we've spoken about previously, but I want other folks who may be listening for the first time or may not know, I want people to understand that national parks, which were really spurred on by the Roosevelt administration, national parks are celebrated for being the protection of land from encroaching urbanism. That is the way that they are framed. However, national parks are trusts that are meant to withhold indigenous land from indigenous people. So the fact that the true and original stewards of this land are not available, like, we're not allowed to live in national parks. We're not to live on our land. We're not allowed to be in those spaces because it's considered a trespass. So I just want folks to understand that national parks, as a institution, because that's what they are, national parks are an institution, that as an institution, they have been used to maintain a white supremacist rhetoric. So to see Mount Rushmore as a national park, as this idea of celebrating American land from sea to shining sea, with these faces carved on indigenous land, this is all to further the fantasy that the American settler state has a benign history, that it was not a history of violence, that this was not strategic, that these are just coincidences that exist, that this land is being held in trust, that this is a space for people to come visit to protect us from encroaching urbanism. That is not the actual reality. If you read, as John just said, the very white supremacist beliefs that Teddy Roosevelt had, as well as many other presidents, you can begin to unpack and unlearn what is often taught to us. And I believe that seeing indigenous folks on the highway, creating a blockade, telling the Trump administration that you're not allowed on this land because it is indigenous land, upends this settler colonial narrative in a really, really overt way. And I think it should be celebrated more than it is. Of course, these people will be criminalized. They already are criminalized. People are facing federal charges. So, so we already see that this is a continuation of the criminalization of land defenders. But I really do urge people to do more research on the history of the creation and the protection of national parks as a means to avoid providing indigenous people our land back.
Yeah, I think one of the points that you are really making here is when they say these were created to protect from urban sprawl or spread. There's two ways to look at a park. What is it doing against a future threat, and what it was doing to end a contemporary threat? And the threat that they were trying to end was our claims to those lands. So the parks had two purposes. One, to put a nail in the coffin of Native claims, and the other is essentially to preserve the land so white people could visit it. It's kind of hard not to it's hard to deny that was the circumstance. All right, let's we got a few minutes before the bottom of the hour. Let's at least begin addressing the Dakota Access Pipeline ruling. It's there's a certain part of me that gets frustrated because when we try to fight something on the merits of the danger that these things create to our people and to our land, it is oftentimes really, really hard to get the right kind of audience. And in this situation, the environmental review is being called into question, the ones that had been done because they were done inadequately. And now the Dakota Access Pipeline has essentially been shut down and drained, is that, as I understand it.
Yeah, so just so that folks have context, the Dakota Access Pipeline is or was a 1,172 mile long oil pipeline that runs from North Dakota to Illinois. And there was a lack of true analysis that was conducted to examine the risk of the Dakota Access Pipeline. And the Standing Rock Sioux tribe has been fighting against the pipeline since 2016, which led to Standing Rock as a social movement in which a number of indigenous and non-indigenous people went and occupied space and were violently arrested, attacked by the police, the National Guard. And so this is a continuation of that conversation. So on July 6th, the U.S. District Court from the District of Columbia ordered that the Dakota Access Pipeline was to be shut down and that it must be drained by August 5th, and that the quote unquote government would conduct a rigorous environmental review to see, to answer to the questions that we've been pushing, or not, that a number of people have been pushing to the forefront about the impacts of pipelines to the environment, to indigenous people. However, though this is a win for a lot of land defenders and environmental activists and the indigenous community, specifically the Standing Rock Sioux tribe, the owner of DAPL, which is this company called Energy Transfer LP. It's a Dallas-based company run by Kelsey Warren. Apparently, he refuses to drain the pipeline and is accepting requests for the oil space in the pipeline to be filled by August. So even though this is like a great win and, the U.S. District Court has sided with indigenous people on this, the person who actually owns the pipeline has refused to participate. So this narrative is nowhere from over.
Yeah, and again, sometimes I wonder if this would have had, if the ruling would have come this way, if the oil price hadn't gutted, So and of course I'm a little cynical because I'm always of the impression that there are other factors that even sway the courts, and I think because of a glut, because of the drop in prices and that kind of stuff, I just wonder how much that factored into it. The other thing is, we try to make the argument about about the threat that this was to our people, and it almost seems like it's an easier argument to make when we start arguing the threat that it has to other species than our own. It's kind of a crazy deal, but that's just kind of the way it is. Hey, look, we're at the bottom of the hour, so why don't we go ahead and take a break and we'll come back. We'll go a little bit more on the Dakota Access Pipeline. Then I want to talk about this ruling, the Supreme Court ruling on Oklahoma, and we'll talk about that when we come back. This is John Kane and with Regan DeLoggins, and this is Let's Talk. All right, thanks for coming back. This is John Kane with Regan DeLoggins. We are still in fund drive, and I know people are saying, isn't WBAI always in fund drive mode? Yeah, we kind of are. But this is the world that we live in. We are listener sponsored radio, so we do depend on you. We don't have corporate sponsors. We don't have government support for our broadcast. And look, we're trying to come up with new and innovative ways to continue to broadcast. And look, we need your help. So again, the pledge line is 516-620-3602. That's the number to make a donation of any size. Make a one-time donation. You can make recurring donations. And look, if you go on to the website, give2wbai.org, that's GIVE, the number 2, WBAI.org. There's a number of ways you can donate. And that site is always up You can always make a donation. And if you make a donation, become a WBAI buddy, please do list that you're doing it in the name of Let's Talk with John Kane and Regan DeLoggins. Just list us, because we kind of have almost a friendly competition where we're trying to all compete with numbers. Part of it is incentive, I guess, to send a message to management when we can produce a bunch of these buddies that in the name of our show. So we need your support. The station needs your support. So by all means, make a donation. Again, 516-620-3602. That's the number to call to make a donation by phone. Before the break, we were talking about the Dakota Access Pipeline. And there's another example of when we had so many people step up, and social media had a lot to do with getting the message out. And then finally, mainstream media came around. Democracy Now!, WBAI's Democracy Now!, stepped up. We started seeing, some of the other major networks in the cable news cycle stepping up. Lawrence O'Donnell and other people making comments, and so it became very, upfront in the face of a lot of people to understand why we were fighting this thing, and for one thing, also making it clear that we're still here. It's easy for people to not recognize that Native people we're still relevant, and we've been marginalized with things like mascots, the whole removal act and that whole policy of the United States put us even farther out of sight. Although we do have a decent population in many of the urban environments, we kind of just slip into the shadows there, and we're not recognized as a Native community in many of even in New York. It's hard to really wrap your hands around the Native community in New York City, even though there's 100,000 Native people who live there. But our territories are usually very remote, and so the news that happens on our territories, missing and murdered Indigenous women, some of the other ills that we're constantly besieged with, they don't make the news. Death by cop. I mean, Native people have a higher percentage of being killed by cops than anybody else across all demographics and all age groups, and yet that's not widely known. Our population's small, and where our population is centered is usually in very separated areas or very remote areas. So, we became visible during that whole Standing Rock debate and confrontation. So we'll take these wins against Dan Snyder and the Washington football team, or against the Dakota Access Pipeline, but it is still concerning that it is still hard for us to get our voices out there and to be heard in a way that isn't sensational. I mean, we shouldn't have to have somebody bleeding. We shouldn't have to have people being abused and beaten to get attention. It's just frustrating.
I totally agree. I think that when it comes to Indigenous voices being heard, it's usually in times of the exceptional, and it's often times of exceptional violence done upon us. For example, people didn't really pay attention to Standing Rock until we were being tear gassed. Then people started paying attention. People didn't start paying attention to our to our Indigenous women and Two-Spirit and trans folks until we started going missing and showing up murdered. Like, it's often that we are not in the forefront, or people begin to consider us when they're running for campaigns and we're a vote for them, because there's a legacy and a history of I'm thinking specifically of presidents, but it's beyond just presidents. But there is a history and a legacy of presidents coming to our reservations, coming onto our land to try to get our vote. So that's another thing. Indigenous folks are not on the forefront of people's minds unless it is that they need something out of us, or we are being abused by the system that settler colonialism has created.
I don't even think it's so much about the vote as much as embracing a feel-good subject that if nothing ever happens regarding a Native issue, nobody's going to pay attention to. So it's low-hanging fruit to make you, if you're a candidate, to make you seem more human or more empathetic, I guess. But at the end of the day, I mean, people forget the Dakota Access Pipeline. That was an Obama era. That was an Obama era project. It just got finished during the Trump administration. So it's sometimes very, very difficult to navigate the politics of all this stuff because the politics is oftentimes very complicated, and there's like a backhanded way that people play Native issues to serve them and never really to serve us. Let's move on. Kind of a big decision, of course, a narrow decision by the Supreme Court on Oklahoma, and in a 5-4 ruling, they have ruled that nearly half of Oklahoma is still Native territory, and it's kind of interesting that this is something that actually needed to go to the Supreme Court in the first place, because we have this debate all the time, even back here in Seneca territory and our territories. Because if there isn't a transfer, if there isn't some legal, if we don't give our sovereignty, if we don't give the land title to the states, then how does the state claim it? I mean, when you do this idea of title search, which it's kind of a crazy deal anyway, but where do they ever come up with some sort of legal claim to claim title in the first place? And we've had this battle oftentimes on Native territories right here within the state of New York. And just because a non-Native person lives on a territory or enters into a lease or has permission to build or whatever else, it doesn't mean that there has been a legal transfer of a title to land from Native ownership and control and title to non-Native. Now, that's not exactly how far this one went, but again, in a 5-4 decision with Neil Gorsuch, who once again stepped on the side of Native people on this thing, basically ruled that nearly half of Oklahoma is still Native territory. And part of it is geared towards things like criminal jurisdiction and how much the state can assert jurisdiction versus the federal government. Don't make no mistake that this is this is it's kind of a big deal.
No, it's a huge deal. I mean, this is historic. So to give context for folks, this is the McGritt versus Oklahoma Supreme Court case. And the ruling on this case came out early today. So this is like very fresh and very new. And what this means is that the U.S. Supreme Court recognized that about half of Oklahoma is indigenous reservation land. And the reason that this came to the Supreme Court in the first place was actually related to a rape case in which McGritt, in which the rape that McGritt committed took site on what is now recognized as part of the reservation based on the historical claim of the Muskogee Creek Nation. So that actually his trial was beyond the jurisdiction of state authorities. So this began with a horrible act, but has led to a more I don't want to say, no, what's the word I'm looking for? Has led to a movement, it led to a different conversation about tribal sovereignty. So McGritt will be still held accountable for his violence, but under tribal law and tribal sovereignty versus Oklahoma court cases. So what started as a smaller case has now become a larger case. And what's really interesting and really important to know is that this means that this is the first time that much of eastern Oklahoma is legally considered reservation land. which means that 1.8 million people that live in the area, including Tulsa, Oklahoma, which is Oklahoma's largest city, are now living on indigenous reservation land. So this specific ruling was for Creek Nation. However, it will and provides substantial progress towards jurisdiction conversations for other nations, including Cherokee, Chickasaw, Choctaw, and Seminole tribes. So even though this is specifically for Creek Nation, this has now expanded the conversation of what is premier law in Indian territory, in Oklahoma. And the ruling today has determined that that law is indigenous law. It is Creek law. And so tomorrow will be the release, the statement will be released tomorrow about understandings of procedures, laws, regulations, public safety, economy, and private property rights moving forward under the implementation that Eastern Oklahoma is a reservation.
Well, one of the things I find interesting is, you look at some of the language that came out of Neil Gorsuch, and he says, look, the government has to be held to its word. And that's what Neil Gorsuch's comment was. But John Roberts, his big concern is how profoundly destabilizing this is going to be to the justice system. And there's a part of me like what you mean is how profoundly destabilizing this is to white people. And there's like no recognition to how destabilizing all of these assumptions that have been made for decades, more than a century. And so when I hear somebody, again, white privilege just can't help but creep into this stuff. And I think one of the things that I think is a positive out of this that goes well beyond Oklahoma is while there has been the Interior Department that has oftentimes stepped up and said, no, there's never been a transfer of native title on this land or that land. And we've experienced that here. The Cayugas in central New York have been going through this, even as they reclaim some of their previously held lands. The Interior Department said, look, just because white people are living there doesn't mean that it ever became legally part of the state. Now there's a Supreme Court ruling that backs some of that notion up. So I think any state that has claimed native lands simply because of an assumption and not based on any kind of legal transfer, and almost none of them have legal transfers, it's going to be interesting to see how this plays out in a much bigger picture.
Absolutely. This is something that's really exciting for myself as a member of these of one of these five nations, and it's the amount of texts that were coming in and people messaging and people and even later on tonight, I will be celebrating this with some Southeastern tribal friends and relatives, because this is a really big deal. Though we do expect significant pushback from the state of Oklahoma, and Congress does have the ability to overturn this ruling, it's an incredibly momentous occasion in which the settler colonial state, the Supreme Court, the U.S. Supreme Court, has ruled in favor of our tribal sovereignty. Now, I don't need the Supreme Court to tell me that I have tribal sovereignty. I know that, and I know that I can exist, on my own as an indigenous person with autonomy, but it's just such a big deal. And to consider that this could be a reservation, that Eastern Oklahoma could be a reservation, could really, as you said, change the dynamics of a lot of other indigenous land ownership conversations. This could really be, if it continues to move in the way that it's moving, this could really change the actual borders and shape of the occupied United States, which is incredibly exciting. Oklahoma became a state in 1907. So this is a relatively new within the history of even just the settler state of the United States, but also just new. This is current, relatively contemporary. It's modern history. And so to see these moments of indigenous sovereignty being really honored in the settler colonial court system, I think is an exciting moment. Like I said, we expect pushback. We expect Congress to overturn this. We expect Oklahoma or the state of Oklahoma to really fight against this because it breaks the status quo and because it will have repercussions that challenge white supremacy. But in this moment right now, I do want to applaud a lot of the people within my own nation and within my sister nations who really worked so hard to make this moment happen. And I look forward to see what happens. I didn't think this was going to happen. I honestly thought they were just going to say nope, but they ruled in our favor. And so Muskegon Creek Nation territory is now Eastern Oklahoma, and Eastern Oklahoma is Indian territory.
Well, and you touched on something here when you said that we don't need them to tell us that we still have a claim to our sovereignty. But what happens in these cases is that the courts are forced to recognize that the arguments that the states or the United States makes about these land titles is false, and that they don't have the evidence to back it up. I mean, this court isn't trying to. This isn't about doing us a favor. It's about telling the state, especially the states, that you've made assumptions that have not been backed up by fact, not by legal fact or anything else. And so these rulings, while they are positive, I mean, I always have to go back to say things like gaming, for instance. When the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the Cabazons, it didn't grant us the right to do gaming. What it recognized is that we had that right. So what this court is ruling isn't that now this land is ours. It's ruling that it always was, and that there has never been there's an absence of legal process to make the claim that it's not that it's not native lands. And you're right, this is going to have major impact. And look, Congress can try to do what they're going to do, but at some point we still come back to the same argument. When did we give? I mean, I say this about sovereignty and even citizenship, for instance. I mean, I know they passed the Citizenship Act in 1924, but when did we accept it? When did we say, all right, our land is now yours? When did we say, okay, we're now accepting subjugation under the Constitution of the United States? It doesn't exist anyplace. And there's no date, there's no surrender, there's no appeal, there's no annexation. All of these things that many Americans probably believe happened, or there must be some legal basis for it. This court is basically just made a big splash saying, no, there's no legal basis for the claim. And keep in mind also that Oklahoma was supposed to be native territory. I mean, it was never. I mean, it's one of those things that not only Oklahoma but even Kansas, these were territories that the federal government was specifically trying to ship native people to. When they were trying to get the Senecas to move, for instance, they told the Senecas, that you can go to Kansas and we'll pay you to get there. And so the Senecas asked the question. They said, well, what's going to be the status of that land? Because it was pretty well asserted that the Senecas owned the land, in spite of doctrine of Christian discovery and all that other stuff. There had never really been any solid claim that the Seneca territory was anything other than Seneca territory. And so the overtures that the federal government made in the attempt to remove Senecas, they said, if you go, the lands will always be yours and it'll never be part of a state. And of course, that's even a bigger distinction because, there are many native territories that sometimes, even though they're defined as reservations, they still are being touted as if they are part of the state. And that's obviously a problem. And so we'll see how this thing plays out.
I do want to just read a quick quote that was posted by SCOTUS earlier today, which was, on the far end of the Trail of Tears was a promise. Forced to leave their ancestral lands in Georgia and Alabama, the Creek Nation received assurance that their lands in the West would be secure forever. And that's what was upheld today within court. And that, to me, is an exciting moment.
I agree. And, it is interesting that, another Republican appointee of the court, is not being bound by politics, but in this situation. And Gorsuch has ruled a few cases, and he's had to rule with the liberals, as they say, because, like you said, when you got the Chief Justice Roberts basically saying, this is a bad ruling because it's too disruptive. Really? This is destabilizing? Well, what do you think? God, how destabilizing do you think it was to get to this point? For centuries, for over a century. I mean, again, when you talk about the late date at which Oklahoma becomes a state, there's a reason it took that long for Oklahoma to become a state, because it was never intended to be one.
Absolutely, I totally agree.
I guess we gotta be wrapping up here.
Absolutely.
Yep.
Okay. All right. Regan, thanks again. Once again, great show. I know we had a few glitches here and there. In fact, I think we had a power outage here, but we kept going nonetheless. So we'll do it again next week, and we look forward to addressing you folks on WBAI in New York City. Yahweh.